Hello, friends, and welcome to the Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast. These episodes have been remastered for better sound quality by Rob at Wrong Way Recording. When you need it done right, you choose Wrong Way. WrongWayRecording.com. Initially imagined by me as a 10-part series, the Diabetes Pro Tip series has grown to 26 episodes. These episodes now exist in your audio player between episode 1000 and episode 1025. They are also available online at diabetesprotip.com and juiceboxpodcast.com. This series features myself and Jennifer Smith. Jenny is a CDE and a type 1 for over 35 years. This series was my attempt to bring together the management ideas found within the podcast in a way that would make it digestible and revisitable. It has been so incredibly popular that these 26 episodes are responsible for well over 500,000 downloads within the Juicebox Podcast. While you're listening, please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Ascensia Diabetes, makers of the Contour Next Gen blood glucose meter. And they have an amazing offer for you. Right now, at my link only, contournext.com/juicebox free meter, you can get an absolutely free Contour Next Gen starter kit. That's contournext.com/juicebox free meter. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. The Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Touched by Type 1. See all of the good work they're doing for people living with type 1 diabetes at touchedbytype1.org and on their Instagram and Facebook pages. This show is sponsored today by the glucagon that my daughter carries, Gvoke HypoPen. Find out more at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. Hey everyone, Jennifer's back, and we're here today to talk about the perfect bolus. So that already sounds like a topic that everyone's going to get upset about when they hear, but I think, but there's a lot of different ideas here. So Jennifer, what I was thinking was boluses differ depending on situation, right? You might have a high blood sugar, a low, you might be falling, you might be rising, you might have a new site. There's
you
a
might
lot
have just
of
exercised. You might, yes.
Keep going, right? You may have just exercised. You might have
You might be ill. You might have your period. You may be coming into having your period. You know, your dog might have eaten the other dog next door, and like you're dealing, right?
You have a little bit of anxiety going, and there's different things. Your dog may have eaten your next door neighbor's dog. Jennifer, has that ever happened in your life?
No, thankfully.
Really? No, psychologists say that if you make up something like that, it comes from something. I don't believe that because my humor is so bizarre that I look back sometimes and I think, but that was something really strange I just said. Does that have any real connection to my thoughts? And I've really looked closely because I've been worried in the past, but I don't think that's true for everybody.
No, I've got a chocolate lab and I don't think that that's even in their, totally not in their nature. So anyway, no, it's never happened, thankfully.
So you people have already learned that chocolate labs are not carnivorous, at least towards other dogs.
Their dogs, no.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So anyway, so I want to start with, I mean, we're just going to pick one, right? Let's say your blood sugar is where you mean for it to be. Your basals are in check. They work well. You haven't eaten in a while. It's the perfect scenario, the one that they described you in the doctor's office the first time you're diagnosed, right?
Right.
Your blood sugar is 95 and you're hungry and you're thinking, what am I going to do? So ideally, we know at this point now from listening to the episodes, we have to figure out what our length of time for our pre-bolus is.
Right.
But how do we know how much to pre-bolus? And I think the answer always has to be, I can't tell you. Jennifer can't tell you. It's situational, but that you'll learn through trial and error. So, but let's make this one general, right? It's a nice balanced meal. You've got some vegetables, some carbs, there's protein. It looks like a plate from a Super Friends episode that the government told you how to eat in the 70s, right? It's the food triangle, let's call it.
The food triangle.
So if you're a nice steady blood sugar, if my daughter was at 95 and I thought this was a pretty, average meal as far as what I expect as far as impact back from it, I might put in all of the insulin, in the beginning. But I also might look and say, hey, there's bread in there, a potato. That might stretch out the action of the impact of the carbs over more time. So maybe I'll put in, 50% or 60% and then stretch it out over a half hour, an hour, just to create, like we've talked about in the past, that kind of blanket of insulin to cover the entire impact timeline of the carbs. I think that the thing to remember is that there can't be really a set idea for what that means. Like maybe you'll figure out a meal eventually and say it's 70% and 30% over an hour. You might get to that point at some point.
And many people do. Mm-hmm. Many people who have pretty consistent intake or like the same things over and over. But the variables that could be around that will sometimes change even your more standard figured out meal.
Yeah. And so I think, so my first step, I'm telling you, any good bolus, the one that has any chance of working, I think is a nice simple way of saying it, has to have a pre-bolus. Like you have to start, you have to start getting the momentum of your blood sugar moving down so that when the carbs start acting, they move up. So that's, to me, that's step one. Now, do you talk about, or do you in your own life use combination of bolus and basal in situations like this?
In some situations like this, perhaps. More often what I do and more often what I teach is pre-bolus based on some of the meal content, because some of that does work together. Right. Things like glycemic index, and also, as you brought in to begin with, where the blood sugar is starting. Mm-hmm. Is it coming in standard at your target? Are you coming in, but it's already dipping down? Are you coming in target, but it's already drifting high? All of that is where you can also look at bolus timing and how much pre-bolus you may need. So, coming in at a blood sugar of 95 with a straight horizontal line the past hour, awesome, that looks great. But the minute you put food in, that blood sugar line is going to start to change pretty quick after that if there's not time for that insulin to tug first. To begin work. Right?
And I hear what you're saying too about like understanding the glycemic load of different like foods. If you have something like, using Chinese food, such a great example because it normally incorporates rice, which stays for a long time and hits you hard, and usually some sugar that'll hit you fast. So if there's something sugary in there, you may need a real, push of insulin in the beginning to combat that initial rise. But that initial rise could get beat up by that insulin very quickly. And now what's left over is the rice that continues to work.
Effect.
Right. And so, go ahead.
So I was just going to follow with, yes, you could in that instance then have the potential for needing both bolus and a basal potential change. Right. And that's also where we talk about basal. Most doctors are like, well, basal shouldn't ever be used for food or covering anything. Well, we've learned very differently, especially with fat. Mm-hmm. Fat requires a huge amount of basal change in the aftermath of eating your typical pizza or, burger and French fries or mac and cheese that's homemade or whatever it might be. Oftentimes you need 40, 50, 60% of an increase in basal for many hours after that meal, or you're going to stay stuck high.
Right. Or you could end up hitting it with so much insulin up front that you think you've avoided that. And then 3 or 4 hours later, you start rising and you think it's for no reason. Right. And it's still that fat is having that effect. Yep. So I like in what I call carby situations, which is not a word, but in higher carb.
It is in our world. In our world, carby is absolutely a word.
Right. So with carby foods, there's a couple different ways I use a temp basal, and we talked about it before. But in this situation, if I thought a meal was 10 units for sure, but I wanted it to be spread out more, Arden's basal rate being 1.4, I might double Arden's basal for an hour and a half and catch 2.25 units that way, and then take some of that out of the bolus up front, right?
Absolutely, because you get a lingering effect from the basal, and you get less up front, but you're still getting the whole bolus you determined you needed.
Okay, same meal, Jenny.
Rapid fire. Same meal, but I walk in the door from work and my spouse says, dinner's ready, and it hits the table. I can't pre-bolus. I didn't know this was going to happen. What do you do? And that's where I'd like you to lay out the idea of over-bolusing for people here.
Yeah, and that's over-bolusing, essentially. That's a good super bolus, as we talked a little bit about before. Mm-hmm. That's a situation where 100%, unless that meal is like a plate of broccoli, right, in which you would never need a super bolus.
Or a pre-bolus, maybe.
Or a pre-bolus, right? In your typical meal that we're saying we're having, 100% a super bolus would be beneficial, where you actually do take a load of insulin that would be your basal behind. You add it on to the suggested bolus for what you're going to eat. And then you may actually knock off the basal behind so you don't go low later, but you've gotten the load of insulin, the push up front.
Right.
The other option that many people do in that situation too is they take the bolus and they may actually turn their basal up 100% for an hour.
Okay. To also try to help with that spike.
Right, exactly. So that they're getting a bolus, they're maybe not quite sure if the food in the bolus, even though it happening at the same time, is going to cause as much of a rise. Mm-hmm. But they're definitely saying, I know I need a lot more because I wasn't able to give that 20, 30 minutes before this.
Yeah, and I think of over-bolusing in two situations. So the one, I don't have time to pre-bolus. So in my mind, the way it strikes me is I now need the insulin for the food, for the high number I know is going to come because I didn't pre-bolus, and some to stop the momentum or stop the arrow, right?
Yes.
And so if I thought the meal was definitely 6 units, but I thought, wow, there's no way this doesn't go to 250, I bolus the 6 units and I bolus like I'm trying to bring down a 250 at the same time, right?
Exactly.
That's like, again, listen, we're calling this series Diabetes Pro Tip. So this is like ninja level stuff. Like, don't try this on day one, but at some point, right? On day one, don't go, I didn't pre-bolus, I'm going to double my please.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, please don't.
But as you're figuring things out, that's a great place to do, as you've heard in past episodes, there's a very famous book called, is it Pumping Insulin?
Pumping Insulin is John Walsh.
And he's the one who talks about super bolus.
Super bolus. Yeah.
Right. The
other.
Go ahead.
Oh, I know you call it something else.
Yeah, right.
What do you call it?
I call it over-bolusing, but
over-bolusing.
I don't know why.
Right. No, I was going to say the other concept that kind of comes in here that you sort of just alluded to is, where is the blood sugar going to likely be? And that trajectory, right. Assuming that, okay, I might be 95 right now, but if I haven't pre-bolus, I could easily be 250 in the next 30 to 60 minutes.
Yep.
Okay, you're taking that value. It's looking at the trajectory of where it will probably be and using that glucose value to add onto the current bolus.
Okay.
So you're avoiding that really high blood sugar.
And what I say on the podcast, which people might remember, is I just say you have to trust that what you know is going to happen is going to happen.
The Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series is sponsored by Ascensia Diabetes, makers of the Contour Next Gen Blood Glucose Meter, and they have a unique offer just for listeners of the Juicebox Podcast. If you're new to Contour, you can get a free Contour Next Gen Starter Kit by visiting this special link, contournext.com/juicebox free meter. When you use my link, you're going to get the same accurate meter that my daughter carries. contournext.com/juicebox free meter. Head there right now and get yourself the starter kit. This free kit includes the Contour Next Gen meter, 10 test strips, 10 lancets, a lancing device, control solution, and a carry case. But most importantly, it includes an incredibly accurate and easy to use blood glucose meter. This Contour meter has a bright light for nighttime viewing, an easy to read screen. It fits well in your hand and features second chance sampling, which can help you to avoid wasting strips. Every one of you has a blood glucose meter. You deserve an accurate one. contournext.com/juicebox free meter to get your absolutely free Contour Next Gen starter kit sent right to your door. When it's time to get more strips, you can use my link and save time and money buying your Contour Next products from the convenience of your home. It's completely possible that you will pay less out of pocket in cash for your Contour strips than you're paying now through your insurance. contournext.com/juicebox free meter. Go get yourself a free starter kit. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. Touched by Type 1 has a wide array of resources and programs for people living with Type 1 diabetes. When you visit touchedbytype1.org, go up to the top of the page where it says Programs. There you're going to see all of the terrific things that Touched by Type 1 is doing. And I mean, it's a lot. Type 1 at school, the D-Box program, Golfing for Diabetes, Dancing for Diabetes, which is a terrific program. You just click on that to check that out. Bowl for a Cause, their awareness campaigns, and the annual conference that I've spoken at a number of years in a row. It's just amazing, just like Touched by Type 1. Touchedbytype1.org, or find them on Facebook and Instagram. Links in the show notes. Links at juiceboxpodcast.com to Touched by Type 1 and the other great sponsors that are supporting the remastering of the Diabetes Pro Tip series. Touchedbytype1.org. When you have diabetes and use insulin, low blood sugar can happen when you don't expect it. Gvoke HypoPen is a ready-to-use glucagon option that can treat very low blood sugar in adults and kids with diabetes ages 2 and above. Find out more. Go to gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. Gvoke shouldn't be used in patients with pheochromocytoma or insulinoma. Visit gvokeglucagon.com/risk.
Right,
Yes.
right. So you can't just pretend this will be the time this doesn't happen. I'll get away with not pre-bolusing today. That doesn't make any sense. It might happen once in a while, but that's some rando reason from something earlier. That's not, that's not.
That's the I ran 10 miles and don't usually ever do that.
And didn't
now,
think about that.
Look at that. My blood sugar doesn't spike.
So now another place to use an overbolus as a pre-bolus is a place where the concept in my mind is the same. The situation's different. What if I've been fighting with my blood sugar all day and I just can't get it down? It's 200, but I know I'm going to eat in an hour. Like it's dinner time in an hour. And I've been, pushing little boluses, little basal rates, and I can't make this 200 move for whatever reason. Maybe it's a site not working well, whatever it is. In my mind, I bolus the meal, I bolus the number, I overbolus up front and create a fall that I then catch with the food. So I reverse. We're going to talk about this in the next episode, but I reverse the way I think about it. I think most of the time we consider, how does the food impact my blood sugar? How does the insulin impact my blood sugar? We don't often enough think about, how does the food impact the insulin? And, right. And we talked about that in an earlier episode too, where we put a little boy's blood sugar into a free fall and caught it by eating at the right time. So
Absolutely.
All we're talking about in any of these situations is timing, right? It's the right amount. Mm-hmm. It's the right amount of insulin at the right time. And if your blood sugar is 300 and you have to eat an hour from now, well, the right amount of insulin is now. And, it is now, and you can't just wait and do your 15-minute pre-bolus on the 300 blood sugar because you've lost already. Right.
Right. And, that kind of goes along too with the concept that catching the potential drop while also sort of avoiding or taking care of a higher blood sugar. In pregnancy with the women that I work with, it's kind of similar. We actually at some point get to bolusing that's like a split meal, where you actually load the front of that meal time with the whole bolus.
Yeah.
But you only actually eat about 70% of the food now. And you catch the drop about an hour later with the rest of the meal.
Interesting.
So what you get is not a spike, not going above those post-meal ranges for pregnancy, but you also catch the drop on the back end and you never go low.
Yeah, that's very similar to how I handle days like Christmas or Thanksgiving. Mm-hmm. The idea that there's always going to be eating. So I'm always pre-bolusing the next grazing opportunity, right? Like,
absolutely.
Oh boy, that's interesting.
Do for holidays is I actually, knowing I'm coming into a grazing time period that's going to be a lot less than precise, a lot less, and a lot of little nibbles along the way behind any holiday where I know I'm going to be hours of nibbling and eating, 25% increase in basal.
Right.
And then again, I bolus along the way. And depending on where glucose is, I might nudge that along the way too.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So now what happens if dinner's taking a little too long to make, and my perfect 95 has turned into a 90, that turned into an 80, that turned into an 85, and now it's 75, and now someone's yelling, dinner's gonna be ready in 5 minutes. I know that for most people that makes them feel like, well, I'm too low to pre-bolus, but no, you're not. And so you have to get some insulin moving, and you'll learn how much you can do over time. But in the interim, it's got to be something, right? You're drifting low. I'm not even talking about for Dexcom users. I'm not even talking about a diagonal down. I'm just this blood sugar just is kind of drifting down. Your pre-bolus still takes as long as it takes to eat. As long as it takes to work. So if you're 75 and drifting down, pre-bolusing right now is not going to make you start crashing down. And if that does happen, that was a coincidence. That's not you. Again, the insulin didn't just start magically working like that, right? Science didn't change. So you still need a pre-bolus. Now, I get if it's a big meal and you're like, well, I can't put in 8 units while I'm 75 diagonal down. You're right. You probably can't. But you could put in some. 20% of it even. And we do this a lot while Arden's at school because we pre-bolus 20 minutes ahead of Arden's meal at school while she's still in a class. And I'm still pre-bolusing if she's 85. So if I give, and Arden gets a big bolus at lunchtime while she's at school, much larger than most any other times in her life. 12, sometimes 13 units, right, for a 145-pound kid. Yeah. And so I might do a 0% upfront and the balance over a half an hour. So it's all kind of getting squeezed in, but it's not all going to come online and be active right away. It might be 20% up front, but you have to get some sort of that momentum happening again on the action of your insulin. You need your insulin to be pulling down when the food goes in.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
And that's important even for kids, I think, in what you're doing. That is important, especially for little kids where you're not quite sure. I know a lot of the parents I work with, but I don't know how much Billy's going to eat, or Susie's a really slow eater, or, today she might love spaghetti and she'll love it for the next 3 days, but then she hates it and I prepared it and I bolused for it. And now what's going to happen, right? For the most part, kids and teens will always eat, as you said, 1%. Let's say that you always know they're going to eat 10 grams of something. Right. Even if you have to change what it is, they're going to eat something for you.
Yes.
So if you can bolus for that little bit up front, it's giving insulin, again, more action before you put food in.
And one of the many, many reasons that Jenny is on the show is because if Jenny wasn't here, that would have been the next thing I would have said. It's perfect. You parents of little kids, it's a perfect idea. Get something moving. Even if it's a little bit, just get something moving. Give yourself a fighting chance. And to Jenny's point, there's an amount of food, if you look back at your kids' meals, they always eat at least a little bit. And by the way, if they really flake out and don't, or if, as in the case of the interview I did yesterday with the mother who said she was so excited she put the insulin in, grabbed some like fast food and drove away, and the kid fell asleep while they were driving away, right? Okay, that might happen. It's happened to me, but still a little bit of juice, right? If you only put a little bit in, all you've done is pre-bolus a couple of sips of juice. You don't have to worry about the food. Right. The point is that the pre-bolus is always important. Listen, if you're crashing down as the food's hitting the table and you're literally 50 and your blood sugar's falling, okay, that's your pre-bolus, right? Right. Okay. You're now
because there's already insulin that's causing the crash.
Yes. Something, whether you meant for it or not, you have been pre-bolused by something, yes, right?
By something.
So good. Mm-hmm. So see that, put the food in, and as soon as that stops, right? As soon as that down arrow goes away, it is time to get your insulin in. You absolutely cannot then say, well, I don't know, I'm 60 and that seems dangerous. No, what's dangerous is that you've put all that food in your body and it's going to start hitting you the other direction. Happened to us last night, and I had to make a significant bolus at a 75 diagonal up blood sugar because I was like, well, I know what's going to happen. Let me stay ahead of it, right?
And the hard thing about using CGMs now, as wonderful 100% as they are, the hard thing is that CGMs do lag in times of quick change.
Right.
And so if you have been diagonaling down, you're waiting for, you want a pre-bolus, but you're not quite sure, go ahead and eat. But as soon as you see that horizontal or a bit of a trend up, I guarantee your finger stick is higher than the CGM is showing you. You're already at a deficit of insulin.
Yes. Yes. The deficit's an important way to think of it. And this is, again, something you'll learn over time. Like,
yes. This isn't like the first month of
again, not on your first day, right? You gotta listen to all the episodes of the podcast, really absorb everything, go through the pro tip stuff, and then say to yourself, and then you have to see it, right? You have to recognize it. There's a way for CGM users, you have to be able to look. There's like a bend in the line. It's hard to put into words, right? But on the 3-hour graph on the Dexcom, the last 3 dots on the right side tell a story about what's happening. And you will get to be able to glance at that at some point and say, oh, this is heading down, this is heading up. I can tell, I know.
Yeah.
And so it's not day one, and it might not be the first month. But if what most of you report back in your emails is anywhere close to true for most, somewhere in the 3 to 6 month range, this all just starts making sense in a way you couldn't have imagined. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Early on in the podcast, I used to talk about it like in The Matrix when Neo stopped the bullets, but that has become such an old reference at this point. I'm afraid right now there's like a 19-year-old going, the what? What are we talking about now?
I'm old enough. I totally know.
At some point, diabetes makes so much sense to you. The bullets aren't even moving. You can just walk in between them. And so you get there at some point, right? Okay. So I'm low, I'm high, I'm falling. Like in the end, I think you're hearing it's all about the right amount of insulin at the right time. Just like we've been saying over and over again. A new site is a good example of, I'm going to put this in here, even though it doesn't sort of fit, but it does fit. And so if you put a new site on and you find that your sites don't work as well immediately once you put them on, or, you just have a site that doesn't seem to be as reactive as you're accustomed to, you still have to do what you have to do. You might have to do it sooner. You might have to do it more aggressively. And I know you're going to say, but what happens when that site starts working suddenly? Well, then it does. But you can't not be aggressive when something like that's going on, because then that's how you end up at 300 all day long, staring at it, wondering what to do next, right?
Right.
Okay.
I think the biggest piece of that pre-bolus message is unfortunately relearning. And it's a daily relearn in the beginning of starting to pre-bolus. Rapid insulin is not rapid. Rapid is a bad word for it. It's a better word than our regular insulin used to be, which they called short acting, and I'd actually call that longer than short acting, I guess. But I mean, rapid is not instantaneous rapid as they tell you it is. Right. It takes a minimum of 15 to 20 minutes to really get moving.
Yes. If you don't leave this episode and in general this series believing that understanding how insulin works in your body is the core of this entire thing, you are not paying attention. So go back and start again.
So you get a slap on the hand.
Well,
I'm kidding.
I didn't go to Catholic school, but I mean, if you...
I did.
Yeah.
12 years.
See, Jenny's like, I know what happens when I don't listen. Someone hits me with a ruler. So now I guess the last piece of this, right, about this perfect bolus thing, right, is... in my heart, it's about remaining fluid. Now, a lot of people are going to tell you really have to count your carbs correctly, right? Which is true. You can't use the wrong amount of insulin. Like, you can't have a 50 carb meal in front of you and only put in 30 carbs and then act like, oh, I don't know why this didn't work. But from listening for me and for a lot of people who've been around type 1 for a while, like I don't think about it as much as carbs. I think about it as units. I look at a plate and I think that looks like 8 units to me. But if I'm wrong, and I am frequently, for reasons that I don't care why, right? Like maybe it's a bad site, maybe I missed on my pre-bolus, maybe Arden's sick. I don't care why, but I miss. Then I readdress immediately.
Right.
Based on my historical knowledge of how Arden acts. I know that if I see a double arrow up after a meal bolus, I screwed something up pretty big. And I go, more insulin. That's right. And you guys are starting to hear this. I'm starting to see you online, like talking to other people, that people are just going, more insulin. I'm like, yes, I know that's from the podcast. And so, but is she diagonal up? Well, then maybe I missed by a lot less. So a little more insulin, or I'll try to bump it back down again, or try to stop the arrow. But staying fluid is the rest of it. 100% staying fluid is the rest of it. And I know that I heard someone say this the other day, and I like the way they put it. that the idea of stacking insulin in a glucose monitor world is not quite accurate anymore. Like this person kind of went a little farther and said you can't really stack insulin when you have a glucose monitor on because you're seeing that you need more insulin. Right. And I thought, boy, that's a big idea. I agree with it in totally in theory. But most of you are going to be taught when you're diagnosed, don't stack insulin. And what they mean when they say that is don't put insulin in at 1 o'clock and then put more in at 1:30 because you're going to get low eventually. And if you're not using a glucose monitor, that very well may be true. But,
could be, right, because you can't follow it.
Yeah, but if you can see your blood sugar, the direction and the speed it's moving in, you'd have to be incredibly insane to stack to the point where you'd cause some sort of a low that would make you incapable of responding to it. Right.
And that's where even, in the CGM one that we talked about, I had mentioned using those event markers. And the event markers can be hugely beneficial now that they also show up right on your screen. So you can actually see, where did I put the insulin in? You don't even have to go back to your pump to look at that or remember when you took your injection. If you just mark it, you will know when those injections went in. You can follow the trend line and you see, okay, do I need more? I don't need very much more. Or I need a little bit more or a lot more, right?
Yep. This is going to get away from this and we'll stop in a second and go to the next idea. But I've been talking to a college student a lot through Instagram messaging. And if you just heard that and think, oh my God, that's me, you're adorable. It could be any number of you. But this one person just had a long, protracted high blood sugar that wasn't coming down. So finally I just said, look, you have to crush this number and crank up your basal. Do a temp basal rate for hours, 6 hours. Let's do 30% more and put in however much insulin you think is going to bring this down. And it took most of the afternoon, but they got there. And then just with that idea of, oh my gosh, I don't have enough basal insulin, the next day, here comes the 24-hour graph, 130 blood sugar, because they're trying to live with not enough basal.
Right.
So as much as we're talking about the perfect bolus here, remember, you can't make the perfect bolus if your basal insulin is wrong.
Correct.
Right? You'll never be able to, because you'll always be replacing basal that doesn't exist. Or if your basal's too high, you'll be causing lows and thinking, oh, this is the bolus, when actually it might not.
And or if you are trying to really be aggressive with your bolusing, then you're bolusing and then finally bolusing too much. And that actually brings you back down, in which case then you might be you're sending yourself back up. And the basal isn't enough in the background, so it becomes a roller coaster.
As infuriating as this is going to be, and then we'll end up this episode, but if your basal's right and you haven't had insulin or food for a few hours, your blood sugar is 80. It's sitting right there. That's how you know you have your basal right. And so
it should be stable.
Right, stable. And so if you have stability at 140, a little more might have stability at 120, a little more. That's how you can learn to play with it. But I'm just telling you that if it was, as intended, by the heavens, then your blood sugar would be around 85 without food or insulin. It's not always going to be like that. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying if you're that far away from that number, you've got work to do on your basal rates.
Right.
Okay. So we are going to wrap this one up and then record the next one right away. Hold on a second.
I want to thank Ascensia Diabetes for sponsoring the Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series. Don't forget, you can get a free Contour Next Gen Starter Kit at contournext.com/juicebox free meter. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. If you're enjoying the remastered episodes of the Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast, you have Touched by Type 1 to thank. TouchedByType1.org is a proud sponsor of the remastering of the Diabetes Pro Tip series. Learn more about them at touchedbytype1.org. A huge thank you to one of today's sponsors, Gvoke Glucagon. Find out more about Gvoke HypoPen at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. You spell that GVOKEGLUCAGON.com/juicebox. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Now, listen, There's 26 episodes in this series. You might not know what each of them are. I'm going to tell you now. Episode 1000 is called Newly Diagnosed or Starting Over. Episode 1001, all about MDI. 1002, all about insulin. 1003 is called Pre-Bolus. Episode 1004, Temp Basal. 1005, Insulin Pumping. 1006, Mastering a CGM. 1007, Bump and Nudge. 1008, The Perfect Bolus. 1009, Variables. 1010, Setting Basal Insulin. 1011, Exercise. 1012, Fat and Protein. 1013, Insulin Injury and Surgery. 1014, Glucagon and Low BGs. In episode 1015, Jenny and I talk about emergency room protocols. In 1016, long-term health. 1017, Bump and Nudge Part 2. In episode 1018, pregnancy. 1019, explaining type 1. 1020, glycemic index and load. 1021, postpartum. 1022, weight loss. 1023, honeymoon. 1024, female hormones. And in episode 1025, we talk about transitioning from MDI to pumping. Before I go, I'd like to share 2 reviews with you of the Diabetes Pro Tip series, one from an adult and one from a caregiver. I learned so much from the Pro Tip series when our son was diagnosed last summer. It really helped get me through those first few very tough weeks. It wasn't just your explanations of how it all works, which were way better than anything our diabetes educator told us, but something about the way you and Jenny presented everything, even the scary stuff, that reassured me that we could figure out how to deal with this and to teach our son how to deal with it too. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. This podcast is a game changer. 25 years as a type 1 diabetic, and only now am I learning some of the basics. Scott brings useful information and presents it in digestible ways. Learning that pre-bolus doesn't just mean bolus before you eat, but means timing your insulin so that it is active as the carbs become active, took me already from a decent 6.5 A1C down to a 5.6 in the past 8 months. I've never met Scott, but after listening to hundreds of episodes and joining him in his Facebook group, I consider him a friend. Listening to this podcast and applying it has been the best thing I have done for my health since diagnosis. I genuinely hope that the Diabetes Pro Tip series is valuable for you and your family. If it is, find me in the private Facebook group and say hello. If you're enjoying the Juicebox Podcast, please share it with a friend, a neighbor, your physician, or someone else who you know that might also benefit from the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast. Jenny Smith holds a bachelor's degree in human nutrition and biology from the University of Wisconsin. She is a registered and licensed dietitian, a certified diabetes educator, and a certified trainer on most makes and models of insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitoring systems. She's also had type 1 diabetes for over 35 years, and she works at integrateddiabetes.com. If you're interested in hiring Jenny, you can learn more about her at that link. If you're living with diabetes or are the caregiver of someone who is, and you're looking for an online community of supportive people who understand, check out the Juicebox Podcast private Facebook group, Juicebox Podcast Type 1 Diabetes. There are over 41,000 active members, and we add 300 new members every week. There is a conversation happening right now that would interest you, inform you, or give you the opportunity to share something that you've learned. Juicebox Podcast, Type 1 Diabetes on Facebook. And it's not just for type 1s. Any kind of diabetes, any way you're connected to it, you are invited to join this absolutely free and welcoming community.